All right, let's get a couple things out of the way first. One, I'm freely going to interchange use of the word text and the word type. The actual name of the tool, for example, is the type tool. And when you're talking about what type looks like on screen, you're basically discussing a typeface. But when you're talking about what you're reading, the actual content of the type, you're talking about text. So the overall topic has to either be called text or type, and after much debate, we decided to come down on the side of text. So we're going to call it text, but I'm also going to use the word type a lot, so don't let that confuse you. The other starting detail is that text used to be a filter. It used to be something you applied by applying a filter to a layer. If we scroll down into our effects palette, for example, you'll see a text subcategory, and that subcategory contains 3 text filters, the middle one of which still has its uses for generating certain number type animations, but for the most part, you're never going to need to use basic text or path text again, because all of their features have now been rolled into the mighty type tool inside of After Effects. And of course, the tool is only how you add type to your scene. Let's select the tool and watch what happens. When I click on it, this palette opens up. Actually, it's a pair of palettes, the character palette, which allows us to control what our type looks like, and the paragraph palette, which allows us to control how the various letters are grouped and displayed on screen, of course. We'll talk about all of that in just a moment. Now, the reason these popped up by default when I just clicked on the tool here is because this little switch is turned on. Auto Open Palettes. There are 2 tools on screen, the Paintbrush tool, which you'll see in use in the last program in this series, and the Type tool. Both have associated palettes connected with them, and those palettes will always automatically open up whenever you click on that tool, whenever this switch is turned on. So if I turn these off and say, no, I don't want to see them, the next time I click off that tool and then click back on it again, the palettes come back because they're set to auto open. Now, if this bothers you, you can always turn off this switch. Then whenever you want to see these palettes, you can always click on the little icon that you see here to bring the palettes to the foreground. We're obviously going to be using this palette, so I'll turn the switch back on again and open those palettes up. And of course, like any of these other palettes inside of After Effects, there are associated keyboard shortcuts for these 2 palettes. It's Command 6 for character, Command 7 for paragraph. That would be Control 6 and Control 7 on Windows. Hit Control 6 when the character palette is in the foreground, and it should hide that palette, and it does. Control 6 brings it back again. For our purposes and for the ability to better see the comp window on our cramped little screen here, I'm going to move the character palette pretty much all the way over to the left. We're not going to really need access to our project window a whole lot, so it's not going to be a big deal that our character palette is largely covering things up. Our background image, for example, is nothing but a layer with a couple of effects and a mask applied to it. That's giving us this nice paper texture that we're going to use as a background for our first type lesson here. Now, there are 2 ways to add a new type layer to your scene. The probably least intuitive way, and you might wonder why it's even there, is to go up to the Layer menu and choose New Text, which adds a text layer to the scene. And the answer as to why that's even there, when the second option, it seems so much more convenient, is at least this method has the advantage of adding a cursor ready for typing right in the dead center of the screen. So if you need to add type to your scene and you want that type to be absolutely centered in your screen, you can use the New Type Layer command from the Layer menu. But I suspect if I undo that, most of you, like me, are probably going to just grab the Type tool and click somewhere in the window and start typing. Now, as soon as we clicked with the Type tool, even before we started typing, what you see up here, a new kind of layer was added to our comp window down below. You can see it in the timeline. In fact, you can see that it actually started not at frame 0 because I had my time marker set up to be at 2:13 instead. We'll fix that in just a second. But if we also look down left, you'll see that we've actually created an entirely new kind of layer inside of After Effects. This is a text layer, and you can recognize it at a glance by its little icon that's got the letter T for text. By default, the layer name came up, Text 1, but my text is still active up in the screen here. I haven't accepted the type that I have typed in here. I've still got my insert cursor at the end. If I want to accept what I've typed here, I can either click off of it somewhere, which is acceptable, although I don't really accept it. I far prefer to use the Enter key on the numeric keypad, not the Enter key on the right-hand side of the letter portion of the keyboard. I'll talk about that in just a second. But the Enter key over on the keypad will accept the edit that we've made, keep the type layer selected, and if you look now down in the layer name, it says, welcome to T ... It's basically helpfully labeling the name of the text layer for us according to what we've typed up here inside our comp window. Now, if any of this behavior looks familiar to you, it's because it's all been borrowed from Photoshop. If you are comfortable working with Photoshop, this is the basic engine that was borrowed and plopped into After Effects. So if you're happy there, you're going to be happy here. I'm still going to go through all the details of how it works, but if you're comfortable with text in Photoshop, you're going to be very comfortable with text in After Effects. And speaking of Photoshop, and just to emphasize how tightly integrated these type engines are, I'm going to hit the delete key and delete the type layer that we have right here. I'll also hit the home key so that our time marker is set back to frame 0 again, so we don't end up with any timing problems down the road. And I am going to hit Command-Tab. You don't need to follow along with this because you probably don't already have Photoshop open. But I happen to have Photoshop running in the background. I'm going to hit Command-Tab on the Mac. That's a Macintosh keyboard shortcut that allows you to toggle from Open Program to Open Program. And I'm just going to come over here to Photoshop long enough to copy some text that I've typed into a document here. I haven't included this document for you on the CD. You can use any document of your own to do this exercise. I didn't want to include this file because it has some very specific type that you might not have on your machine, and then you'd get an error and then you would hate your life. And so I didn't want you to go through that kind of pain. I wanted you to just learn this little trick. So the trick is select the type in Photoshop, copy it. Let's Command-Tab back over to After Effects, click with our type tool and paste. And not only does the text come over, but it comes over complete with its formatting. It comes over with the font that I was using. It comes over with the color that I was using. It even preserves the original point size of the type that I was using. That should demonstrate just how integrated these two type systems are. Let me undo that a couple times. Click, click. Get rid of our type layer. Now, I mentioned a second ago that there were two ways to create a new type layer. One was in the layer menu. The other was by clicking with the type tool. Well, in fact, there are two ways to create a new layer with the type tool. One is by simply clicking, and simply clicking puts us into point type mode. Type that in and then hit the Enter key over on the numeric keypad. The other way to add type with the type tool, rather than just clicking, is to click and drag. When you click and drag, we add a new type layer that puts us into paragraph type mode. The simple box that you see on screen represents the powerful paragraph mode. I'll hit Enter once again to accept that. Now we'll discuss all of the formatting issues with paragraph mode in just a second. But first, I'm going to delete the paragraph box that we just created because I told you that the two ways to add type on screen with the type tool were point type mode and paragraph mode. But what I didn't tell you is that there are actually two ways to add a paragraph box. One that I just showed you was clicking and dragging. The second is to hold down the Option key on the Mac, the Alt key on Windows, which when you click and drag allows you to drag a box out from the center. Notice what's going on there? Where I clicked with the Option key held down, Alt key on Windows, and started dragging is now the center of the box that's growing on screen, as opposed to drawing from the upper left-hand corner to the lower right-hand corner. It's a small distinction, but it should offer you a little bit of creative freedom when you're designing your type layouts. All right, I'm going to hit the Enter key, and then I'm going to delete that layer. And I want to show you that point type mode can also create paragraphs if you're willing to do the wrapping of the paragraph manually. Note, of course, that as you continue to type with point type, the type is just going to keep going in a straight line until it exits off screen. But if I back up my cursor key here to before the letter C, for example, and hit the Return key on the Macintosh or the Enter key on Windows that's right next to the letters on the keyboard, not the one that's over on the keypad, we'll enter a soft return in the text on screen and add another line to our point type. Use the arrow keys to move over to the end of the line. And continue typing a paragraph, adding carriage returns as needed. Now I'll hit Enter again to accept it. And if we look really closely on screen, and it may be kind of difficult to see because of the color of our selection handles. In fact, let's change the color of our label. Let's change it to something maybe a little darker, like violet. And since now the handles of the layer reflect the label color of the layer, we can see them a little more distinctly now. And let's talk about some ways that we can interact with our type. Now, I still have my type tool selected. We've got this little I-beam with a dotted line box around it. And if I move that over our type, you'll see the cursor will change, the box will go away. And instead of being in a mode where if I clicked and dragged, I would create a new text box, I changed to edit mode. That's what the I-beam without the little box means. And I can click anywhere inside the type to edit or modify the text in here. But another important thing to note, if I hit the Enter key again to exit our type block there, is even if you don't have the type tool selected, if, for example, you have the selection tool selected, you can actually still edit text with a little bit of a shortcut. And that shortcut is simply to double-click on a type layer. And when you double-click on the type layer, your tool changes to the type tool, and it automatically selects all of the type in the type block. We have several lines in point type mode at this point in the training. I'm going to actually convert this to paragraph type mode. I'm going to cut it first of all. I'm going to hit Command X on the Mac or Control X on Windows to cut this text. Then I'll hit Enter and Delete. That'll get rid of our previous text layer. And now I'm going to click and drag a paragraph box and paste, and that's now going to paste our type into the paragraph box. Obviously, the paragraph box constrains the type, so it stays inside of the box. And we're actually seeing some jagged line breaks here because we entered some hard line breaks into our previous line. So let me get rid of those real quick. Only take a second. Just going to go to the point where a line starts and hit the delete key to kind of return ourselves to a more normal paragraph here. And let me talk about the two different ways that you can interact with a paragraph type mode box here. If I hit the Enter key, you're very accustomed at this point in time with interacting with the various handles that you see on a layer. And of course, to make them more visible, again, I'm going to change the label color back to violet again so we can see them a little more clearly. But on paragraph type boxes, these handles behave a little differently depending on which tool you might actually have selected. If you have the type tool selected, for example, and the layer itself is not in edit mode, you won't get any reaction at all when you hover over the outside edges of the type. If, however, you click into the type so that you're now in edit mode, you'll see these handles around the outside of the box, and if you click and adjust these handles, you'll actually be adjusting the paragraph's flow box, the area within which the text is allowed to go, and by making it bigger, you'll actually change the way that the text wraps, and making it smaller, you'll change the way that the text wraps, etc. Let me hit the Enter key to get out of that mode. Let's go up and adjust these handles now using the arrow tool and watch what happens. Instead of adjusting the paragraph now, we're actually scaling the type. And this works with any kind of type that you see on screen. An important thing to point out though, let me delete this paragraph here and we'll type in something a little bit shorter. This time I'll just type in I8NY, which according to Gary Larson is what's on Godzilla's bumper sticker. Then let me hit the Enter key once again to go back into our regular layer select mode. And I'm going to go down really quickly and change the layer color again to violet again so we can actually see the handles. And let's get our selection tool and show that when we're not in paragraph mode, when we're actually just in selection mode, the handles on the outside allow you to scale the text. But when we're dealing with a single line of text like this, the default anchor point for that text, according to After Effects, is the lower left-hand corner of the first letter that you type. So when you're clicking and dragging, it's fine if you grab the upper right-hand corner and scale things. You'll scale from the lower left-hand corner. But be careful if you just grab and start scaling one of the other corners, because if you'll notice, when I click and drag the lower right-hand corner, I don't have to drag very far down at all before I've scaled my type unusably in the vertical. So always kind of take a look and see where the anchor point is on screen, and look for a control handle somewhere opposite that before you start scaling. Now, one thing that you may notice as we scale this type up, even though I started out with 36-point type, as I scale this way up here, it's staying razor sharp. And by now you probably recognize that that's because After Effects is continuously rasterizing this type. If we look down in the timeline, in fact, we have no option but to have this type continuously rasterized. That's the way it is by default. And it is, in fact, by default also set to best quality, which is great. But what does that mean with effects? Well, you may have noticed by now in the course of this series that an old limitation of After Effects is now gone. You can now apply effects to continuously rasterized layers. That includes collapsed compositions, continuously rasterized Illustrator files, and, of course, type. So if we want to apply, say, a drop shadow to our type here, we are free to do that, even though our layer is continuously rasterized, which is just great. So here we are with a nice drop shadow on our type. Let me point out one other cool thing about type. Even if you turn this into a 3D layer, even if we click on the little frinkahedron to make this into a 3D layer, and then grab our rotation tool and rotate this around a bit in space and give ourselves a nice sense of perspective to our I-8 New York slogan here, even at this point, our type remains fully editable. So I can click in here, and the selection of the type even shows up skewed in 3D space, where we would be free to actually edit the type if we wanted to change what letters make up the type or the formatting, etc., etc., etc. And of course, we adjust all of that formatting with the character palette, which is the very next stop on our destination. Before we get there, though, I'm going to get rid of this 3D layer because that's only going to confuse things. I'll turn off this switch. Let's get a closer look at the character palette. Let me bring my layer over where we can see it a little bit more clearly by holding down the Command key on the Mac, Control key on Windows, while I still have the Type tool selected. That gives me, temporarily anyway, the Selection tool and allows me to move our layer. And then when I release that keyboard shortcut, I go back to the Type tool, which is cool. Now, as long as I have the Type tool and our Type layer is selected, anything that we change over here in the character palette will reflect on the entire layer. If, on the other hand, I actually select only a single character inside a text layer and make a choice inside our character palette, for example, I could choose another kind of Helvetica, like black condensed, and that will only affect the selection. A third option at this point is to actually have nothing selected. If I hit the return key and then hit the F2 key to deselect everything, now if I make any changes in this palette up here, for example, if I chose another font like Baskerville, and we're back down to 36 points here, and click on screen now, that'll become the new default typeface and type size, etc., instead of the previous one that I was using. So the changes that you make in the character palette will either affect a selected character, a selected layer, or your default settings for any layers that are coming up down the pipe. Now, if you've used other Adobe applications, you are probably familiar with most of what's going on up here in the Type palette. But just as a quick refresher, we have the font names available in the upper left-hand pop-up here. These are fonts that you actually have installed on your machine, so yours may look different from mine. What's in this pop-up depends entirely on what applications you've installed and what fonts they've installed and what fonts that you've bought and whether or not you've properly installed them, etc. So what you have may not look like what I have, but whatever font families you have installed on your machine will be available in this pop-up. If a font, such as Arial, has separate family members, like different weights or italic versions of the fonts, those are available in the pop-up that's down below. So Arial Regular by default also is available in italic, bold, and bold italic modes. So that's all pretty obvious. What may not be quite so obvious, if I go back and select our layer here, and the weight pop-up has gone blank now because we have mixed styles in our selection here. What may not be completely obvious is if I just click inside the font name and use the up and down arrow keys, I can actually move from font name to font name and instantly see the change show up in my composition on the right. So this is an incredibly cool way to audition different fonts, to audition different designs, different looks until you find something that you really like. I'm going to look for a nice serif font that sort of looks like the classic license plate font. Chaparral Pro, that'll do. Now at this point, I can highlight one of the individual characters in our selection here and try a different font. I can just once again use the arrow keys until I settle on something nice and heavy and fat. And that looks pretty good. Arial Rounded MT Bold. That's going to do us just fine. Now even though these fonts are technically the same size, and don't worry so much about the 36 points over here not really reflecting on the actual point size of what we're seeing on the screen here. We scaled this layer after we added the text, so the original text that we put down is being scaled to a different size, but that size is not being reflected here in the palette. This palette is telling us what the original size of our layer is, and you'd have to check the transform properties down in the timeline to see what that was being scaled to. But if we took this value down from 36 to something like, say, 32 and hit the Enter key on the numeric keypad, that'll bring our typeface down somewhat. I might want to go up one more. Let's try 33 and hit Enter again. And that brings us to a nice size that's going to work well for us. However, what I just did, selecting this field and actually typing in the number, is about as brute force as you can possibly get with After Effects type, and probably one of the most inefficient ways as well. There are so many different ways to enter values in the various windows that you see here, and most of them are easier than what I just did. Of course, there's the familiar pop-up on the right, which allows you to choose from a bunch of system-friendly font sizes that are available for you to just choose from. There's also the up-down arrows on the left-hand side of the value that allow you to move things 1 pixel at a time. A little bit quicker, perhaps, is to just highlight the value that you want to deal with and then use the arrow keys on your keyboard. Tapping the up arrow key raises the values in these windows by 1. Tapping the down arrow key decreases the values by 1. So that's a fairly quick way to audition different sizes. But there's a cool feature in After Effects that I wish was in Photoshop. This is unique to After Effects, and that's the ability to hover over the icon that's in front of any one of these properties. And when you hover over the icon, you'll see the familiar finger with the little arrows coming out of it. That's right, you can scrub this icon, click and drag, and that'll allow you to dial in a value on screen while you're dragging around. And it will give you, as quickly as it can, a real-time preview of the results so that you can quickly dial in a value that you like. Now, of course, you can colorize what you see on screen. We've got all black type here, but if I wanted to, for example, make our 8 red, just click on the color chip to bring up your system's color wheel or color selection doohickey. Whatever you're presented, according to whatever system that you're on, is going to work for you. Just pick a nice medium to dark red. And now the type that we have highlighted will be that red. Of course, it's hard for us to see because we're seeing a negative version of that, and we're seeing this negative box that's showing us what's highlighted. There's a great keyboard shortcut for hiding this selection while still keeping it selected. Of course, we could deselect things if we wanted to by just hitting the Enter key, but I want to keep this 8 highlighted because I want to keep working with it. And the way to do that is hold down Command on the Mac, Control on Windows, add the Shift key, and type the letter H. And that hides the selection while keeping the selection still active. So any choices that we make will affect only this letter, but the highlight's not in the way. For example, if I wanted to add a white stroke around our number 8, I would click on the little stroke icon that we see here. And it's very, very easy at that point to just pick the white chip from the 2 helpful chips that we have here right next to our color chips. Click on that, and that sets a white stroke around our number 8. Now, this is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. The default setting for a stroke is to have the stroke appear in front of type. I almost never like a stroke to appear in front of type because as soon as you start adjusting the stroke, which you do with this numeric value right here, if we click and drag that, it takes almost no adjustment at all before your fill disappears entirely and you've obscured it with your stroke. That's why this pop-up is so useful. The stroke over fill pop-up is the default. I prefer fill over stroke, which means that the stroke grows out from behind a number and the number always retains the integrity of its original shape. Some other controls over here allow you to control the vertical size of an individual character without affecting its horizontal scale at all. And let me undo that. And I need to re-hide my selection again. Once again, Command-Shift-H, Control-Shift-H on Windows, and the character width slider works exactly the same way, but adjusts essentially the fatness of a character instead of the height of a character. Pretty easy to understand. Now I'm going to hit the Enter key again to select all of our letters in our layer here and show you the difference between these 2 properties right here. The tracking property adjusts the overall spacing between the letters in a general sort of way. You can adjust this to basically space out all of the letters evenly to create a little bit more room between the letters or to have all of the letters gang up, etc. That's a little bit different from the kerning control that's over here to the left. Kerning has to do with a per character spacing between letters. Now, Adobe applications do a pretty wonderful job when using professionally created fonts of generating automatic kerning that works pretty well. So you'll very rarely have to override these settings. But should you need to, if, for example, we decided we wanted the number 8 to be a little bit closer to the letter I for some reason or other, We could either select the two letters together, or we could simply click in between the two letters. Both cases will have exactly the same result, and we could adjust from this automatic metrics version. We could dial in a value to kern things to. A negative value moves the elements together. So if I drag this to the left, we're moving the two letters together. Drag it to the right to actually spread them apart. A positive value will add more space in between two characters. Now there's a keyboard shortcut for this that's extremely useful, and that's hold down the Option key on the Mac, Alt key on Windows, and hit the right arrow key to add kerning between characters, and hit the left arrow key to reduce kerning between characters. It's worth pointing out that when you use the arrow keys, it jumps in increments of 20 here in the palette, whereas just clicking and dragging moves, of course, in units of 1. To illustrate this next feature, I'm actually going to hold the Shift key down and hit the right arrow key, and that's going to select the character 8. In fact, if I kept hitting the arrow key, it would continue to select layers one at a time. But I only want to select the number 8. Let's talk about a couple of other very useful keyboard shortcuts that we can use in conjunction with type. For example, a keyboard shortcut for raising or lowering the size of type is hold down Shift Command on the Mac, Shift Control on Windows, and hitting the period and the comma keys. Now, don't look at the period and comma. Look at the chevrons above the period and comma. The right-handed chevron is a greater than sign, so that will make your font size greater. The left-pointing chevron is a less than sign, so that'll make your font smaller. So Shift Command right arrow makes our type bigger. Shift Command left arrow makes our type smaller. That's a quick way with the keyboard to, say, reduce our type tremendously from where it started. And as you see, we went from a 36-point type down to 24. In the lower left-hand corner here, this controls the baseline shift. That allows us to raise a number up from the baseline, should you need to do that for whatever reason. There's a keyboard shortcut for that as well. On the Mac, it's Shift Option up arrow. On Windows, that'd be Shift Alt up arrow to raise the baseline. Shift Alt down arrow on Windows. Shift Option down arrow on the Mac moves down the baseline of any selected text. So we'll take that baseline back to its original starting point. And let me quickly return our font to its original size as well. Hit the Enter key on the keypad to accept our changes here. That looks pretty good. In fact, it looks so good, I think I'm going to delete it because the next things I need to show you, I need paragraph text for. So we're going to get rid of these elements that we see on screen here. Let me hit the Delete key. And now I'm going to use a feature that I've never ever used inside of After Effects before. I'm going to hit the Tab key for just a second to tab away my palettes. And if we click on the yellow solid here inside the solids folder, the yellow solid is what I've applied effects to back here to create our paper layer that you see here. And if we scroll over in the comp window, you'll see I have a comment stored inside this layer. And I'm going to use this handy feature, this comment, to actually bring in a paragraph of text. Let's click on the comment to select all the text, hit Command-C on the Mac, Control-C on Windows to copy it. And now let's come back over to our composition window. We'll hit the Tab key again. I still have my type tool selected, so I'm going to drag out a nice paragraph box of text, and I'm going to hit Paste. Let me hit the Return key to keep our layer selected here, but exit edit mode. And now I can go over here and scrub our values a little bit to maybe dial in a larger font size. Somewhere around 33 is probably fine. I don't really want to use Arial Rounded MT Bold. I'd much rather use something that looks a little more handwritten perhaps. So let me audition a few fonts here until I find something that looks fairly nice. Bernhardt Modern Standard looks pretty good, but I think I might like an italic version. Yep, that's pretty good. I'll go ahead and tab down to my font size and use the up arrow key to raise the size a little bit more. Now that we've created this more delicate version of our type, I want to raise the font size a little bit. I don't like the color very much, so let me come over here and click on this little / icon, which is going to remove the color from our stroke. That'll fatten up our foreground a little bit. And for the foreground, I'm just going to return back to black. Now that we've got our type in here, I want to adjust it just a little bit. I want to give ourselves a few subparagraphs to work with here. For example, I'm going to go just in front of our quotation marks here, delete that space, and hit the Enter key to start a new paragraph at that point. I'm going to need to make a couple of edits here because I am quoting Gilbert and Sullivan, so I probably need to be accurate here. So let me go to the beginning of the word the, which I technically need to change to add the shift key, and select the, type the letter A, and that replaces the selection. I need a comma after the word doc, so I'll add that. Select the space following that and hit the enter key to start another new paragraph. Oops, the word of actually should be in a pestilential prison with a lifelong lock, awaiting the sensation of a short, sharp shock from a cheap and chippy chopper on a big black block. So, even though some of my text has extended beyond our paragraph box here, I can still select all, and I can use my keyboard shortcuts to reduce our font size until all of our text comes back on screen if I want to. Or I could blow things back up again a little bit. I still have a little text spilling out the bottom here. I could adjust the leading. The leading is the spacing in between lines, and it's controlled by this little portion of the character palette right here. It's set to auto by default, but if I start scrubbing that value, I'll immediately start at 0, which of course means all of our type is sharing the same line. That's no good. I'm going to crank that to the right until I come up with a nice, pleasant distribution of our type that still has all of our type appearing on screen. If I want the keyboard shortcut for leading with all of my type selected, I just hold down the Option key and use the up arrow key to decrease the leading in between our lines, and the down arrow key will increase the leading in between our lines. Now, I don't like the fact that I've got a couple of little orphans here on these two lines, so I'm going to easily modify that by coming over to our paragraph control here, and I'm just going to briefly tap the Command key on the Mac or the Control key on Windows to get access to my arrow tool so that I can adjust the width of my paragraph box here, which will force a couple of companion words to wrap down and now share lines with their neighbors. Hit the Enter key once again to accept those corrections. We've still got our text selected here. And let's talk now about some of these other switches that we see down here at the bottom. These are basically different ways to display our typefaces. If instead of Bernhardt Modern Standard, we were using a font that did not have a subfamily that included italic, if, for example, we select our W.S. Gilbert line here, and let me hide that selection so that we can see what we're doing here, but it's still selected. If instead I selected a font that I know on the Mac, for example, like let's say New York. Let me pick New York here. If I know that it only has a regular version, there isn't a bold version or an italic version of New York. There's just standard New York. Well, if I choose New York and I really need it to be bold, I can click on this Faux Bold button, and that will fatten up the type a little bit. It basically just stretches it out a little bit, makes it fatter. And if I need it to be italic and I don't have an italic version, I can hit this Faux Italic button, which will skew the type just a little bit and make it appear to be italic. It's much, much better in practice to use a font that has a genuine italic or a genuine bold, because there's a lot more to a typeface than just making it a little fatter and tilting a little bit. Most italic fonts have really nice details in them, for example. But if you really need to, you can use these in a pinch. To the right of that, we have icons for all caps, which makes, of course, everything capital. Or as an alternative, small caps, which takes all of the lowercase letters and makes them into little teeny tiny capitals, which can be a nice look as well. Very good for greeting cards and other sort of classy things. And to the right of that, we have the superscript and the subscript buttons, which allow you to create, in the case of superscript, small versions of your letters that are elevated above the baseline, and in the case of subscript, small versions of your letters that are lowered slightly below the baseline, if you need to do either scientific notation or footnotes. Let me turn those off, and I'll also turn off the faux italic and the faux bold, but I do think I'll keep this as small caps because that looks kind of nice here. Now, it's worth noting that the character palette has a flyout menu, but the flyout menu mostly contains options that are also available at the bottom in the icons that I just showed you, things like all caps, superscript, subscript, etc. Smart quotes is an option that changes the inch marks that you get by default when you hit the quotation key into actually curly quotes that curve in the correct direction. And if you can understand what I'm saying, you probably want to show font names in English, unless you are multilingual. But you do have the option of turning this off in case you reside in the country that does not use English as the native language. And of course, the last thing in here that I'm not going to choose is the reset character command, which will take your character palette all the way back to neutral. Now let's move on from the character palette to a quick look, I promise quick, at the paragraph palette. Now, to see some of the things in here a little more clearly, we might want to reduce our 4 main paragraphs here to 2. So let me hit the delete key here and give us one longer paragraph stanza up here, and then another longer paragraph stanza here. So now we have this top line, and we have these two paragraphs. And I'm going to select these bottom two paragraphs, and that's what we're going to look at really quickly with the paragraph palette. Let me once again hide our selection here so that we can really see what we're doing. The icons across the top are various ways of justifying our type. You're probably very familiar with these. Left justification is the default setting. The next button over is centered. The next button after that is right justified. Then we have left force justify, which if you click on it will force justify all the lines except for the last line, which will leave hanging flush left. The next choice will do the same thing, only center any hanging lines. And the one after that will do the same thing, only right justifying any hanging lines. And the last option will force justify every single line. Let's go back to our left justification here. And the controls down below are the left-hand indent, which if we crank that over a little bit should be fairly self-explanatory. It sets an indent on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm going to set this back to 0. The control below that sets the indent of the very first line. So if you crank this over to the right a little bit, the first line will be indented, but the subsequent lines will not be. Let me take that back to 0. Over here to the right, we can adjust the right-hand indent, which is similar to just dragging in the box on the right-hand side. But if we crank this over, we'll eventually reach a value where we're starting to knock words down to the next line, etc. I'll set that back down to 0. Let's talk for just a second about creating a hanging indent. And that means you want the first line to stay flush left, but you want the subsequent lines to be indented. To do that, first indent all of the lines, say to a value of perhaps 30. You take the first line and set it to a negative 30 value. And with that quick adjustment, we've created a hanging indent where the paragraphs are in fact indented below the first line, which is not. I'll set those back to 0 again. I'll just directly enter the 0 values. The two controls below that are the space at the beginning of a paragraph. I adjust this down and it adds a space above a paragraph. Let's knock that back down to 0 again. And to the right, space after a paragraph. You'll notice in this case, because I only have these two paragraphs selected, that when I adjust this, it's only going to add spacing in between the first and the second paragraph, but not the title and the first paragraph. So those are various ways of adjusting your paragraphs. Very, very easy to work with. I do want to point out a couple of things in the flyout menu here for paragraph, though, which I think are a lot more useful than the flyout menu commands on the character palette, which are mirrored by switches in the palette. One of them is this first item, Roman hanging punctuation. Without selecting that, let's take a look and see that we actually have quotation marks in our layer, right? Let me hit the return key to make sure that these two paragraphs aren't selected anymore. And then I'm going to hold down the Z key long enough to zoom in on this portion of the comp window here so we can clearly see we have some quotation marks starting out our quote. If, with this layer still selected, I turn on this first item, Roman hanging punctuation, what that's going to do, it's going to justify all of the letters that make up these lines flush left and create a nice clean line. And any hanging punctuation, any extra bits of punctuation like quotation marks are going to be actually outside of the left-hand margin that defines the text. This really usually creates a nicer, cleaner look than having a line of type indented to include quotation marks. So I really like turning this feature on. I think it's a great feature. The other choices worth noting here are essentially a toggle where you get to choose between whether or not you want the leading to be measured from the top of one line to the top of the next, or from the bottom of one line to the bottom of the next, which, that's kind of a choice that you need to make based on what you're expecting to see. I just leave it at the default. But the next couple of choices, the Adobe Single Line Composer and the Adobe Every Line Composer, are best seen if I zoom back out again. So let me hold down the Z key long enough to get my zoom tool. Then I'll add the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows to turn that into a zoom out tool. And I'll go out one click, then I'll pan over with our hand tool there so that we can see all of our script again. It's still selected, so choices that I make in the paragraph palette will have some meaning. If I choose the Every Line Composer instead of the Single Line Composer, what the software is going to do is it's going to look at the spacing between all of the lines and all of the words and possibly make a different choice other than the one that we see here on how it spaces things out in our paragraphs. And in fact, it does. By analyzing all the lines, it's come up with an arrangement that it believes presents us with a more balanced page. And in fact, it probably is. The top paragraph now kind of mirrors the bottom paragraph. This is the Single Line Composer, which adjusts spacing on a line-by-line basis, and that looks okay. But the Multi-Line Composer actually tries to take into account the look of the whole page, and by analyzing the entire page, comes up with a different layout. So if you don't like what After Effects has given you by default as far as paragraph layout is concerned, try choosing the multi-line composer instead. If you have a ton of text on screen, it can take a teeny tiny little extra bit of calculation to come up with the results. But frankly, if you have a machine fast enough to run After Effects, you're not even going to notice that that feature is on, except for the fact that you're going to end up with better looking text. So that is a tour of how to put your text on the page, how to format it, how to control the look of the font, the way that the paragraphs sit on the page, etc. Bit of a long intro, but there's a lot of stuff to pack in there. Now, though, let's move on to what you've all been waiting for, and that's how to animate this stuff, because the new animation features in After Effects text have to be seen to be believed. But that's in the next section. I'll see you there.